From fitness routines to mental resilience, navigating personal goals to tackling burnout, we could all use a little help being human. And that is what the Life Kit podcast from NPR is here to do. As I'm sure you've noticed, life does not come with a manual, but you still have to make choices every day, some big, some small, and these shape the direction of your life. Well, Life Kit delivers strategies to help you make meaningful, sustainable change. I personally am still in summer mode over here, and lately Life Kit has been really delivering with advice on how to improve your grilling or make a salad for your next picnic, how to beat the heat on a humid day. Ice towels, people, ice towels, they really make a huge difference. But of course, even when you are in summer mode, life still presents much thornier issues, and Life Kit has recently done episodes on preparing your home for possible flooding, staying out of credit card debt, making hard decisions together with your spouse. I promise, if you go to the Life Kit feed and take a scroll through the topics, you will find something that will help with a dilemma in your life. So go ahead and check it out. Listen now to the Life Kit podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. Jody here, and as you may know, we are in the middle of our usual late summer break, running some of our favorite episodes from the archives. But I am popping in here with a special intro with a note to say that, as it happens, we were thinking about rerunning our episode about the founding of the Smithsonian this week. And as you most likely know, President Trump has really ramped up his attacks on that institution. There are plans to do a full review of museums to make sure that they are in line with this administration's view of American history. We talked about that view of American history a bit ago in our special about the whole America250 kickoff. That was back in July, so go and track down that episode if you haven't heard it. And then this latest development. As you have likely seen, Trump specifically talked about the Smithsonian and specifically talked about the portrayal of slavery as being, in his eyes, too negative. So, lots to say about that, and that is our plan. We are going to run this episode, which you'll hear in a minute, but then we are also popping away from our late summer vacation to record a special reaction episode, an emergency podcast, if you will, about these latest developments. This is your chance to hear NIki and Kellie, two actual historians, talking about this latest attack on history. And we're going to post that as soon as it's done in the newsletter for our subscribers. So we're trying to make the newsletter the home for this kind of analysis, our look at America250 and how the work of history is playing out right here in 2025. So if you want to hear our thoughts, if you want to get that episode, and if you want to support our efforts, go subscribe to the newsletter right now, thisdaypod.com. All right. Does that make sense? That sound like a plan? thisdaypod.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. America250 Watch, our special episode on the latest Smithsonian news. Do that. And in the meantime, here is our episode about the founding of the Smithsonian, recorded last year. Let's go. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, it was August 10th, 1846, President James K. Polk signed the Smithsonian Institution Bill into law. This would establish the Smithsonian Institution as a series of museums and research institutions. Today, more than 175 years later, as you most likely know, it is the world's largest such institution, 21 museums, the National Zoo, 9 research facilities all around Washington, D.C., kind of I would say, one of the defining features of that city. But in that initial moment, way back in 1846, it was just an idea, and it had a little bit of funding and a lot of controversy. It took about 8 years of congressional squabbling about what would be done with the money that a man named James Smithson had given to the United States for the, quote, increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. So let's talk about the various things that the Smithsonian Institution could have been and how it ended up the way it is and whether it is still fulfilling that initial vision as put forward by James Smithson. So here, as always, Smithsonian Institution aficionados, I would say, I'm going to venture, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
If you've ever wanted to talk shit about the Smithsonian Institution, now's your moment. But I have a feeling.
Get it all out.
Yeah. What's your relationship with the Smithsonian? I want to hear that before we get into the history.
I love it. I love it.
I've actually not spent that much time in Smithsonian institutions, in part because I had never been to D.C. until, I think, after college.
You didn't do the high school trip to D.C.?
Really?
We didn't have high school trips to D.C.
Wow.
Actually, the one high school trip we had to D.C. was for March for Life.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So, very different kind of experience, different relationship to science.
Near the Smithsonian, right? Just geographically. But,
That's crazy to me because I went to Howard and I felt like I was always at the Smithsonian's, always at the, well, not just the Smithsonian, but everything, sort of downtown, all of the monuments was like fair game.
yeah. I grew up, I went to high school in D.C. and certainly like the Smithsonian was just, that's in your backyard. I mean, I'll say the kind of way that it was talked about to me by my parents was, I think, sort of really related to what we're going to talk about today. But, as a like, you don't know how good you have it kid kind of situation to A, have this in your city, but B, I just remember like very early on them impressing upon me how incredible it was that these were free. And saying like in most other cities museums cost money, and the fact that you can walk in free, they were using that to kind of then take it a step further and make an indoctrinate their son into the that the government has a role and that subsidizing this kind of thing is an important role and so forth. But just like that simple fact, and there's some interesting history and even some moments where there were questions about whether it would be free. Them harping on that impressed upon me something that I think is reiterated by reading about the history of the founding, of just kind of how special and unique of an idea this whole thing really was.
It's kind of wild to me too because I'm a historian, my husband's a pilot. When we go to DC, we go to like the Blacksonian, which is what I call it. We go to all of the the historical museums, but then there's also the Air and Space Museum as well that's like huge, and we spend a lot of time there. You can be right-brained or left-brained and still really engaged with everything that it has to offer. And that I think is really cool.
Yeah, and I just to underscore like the freeness, that was the thing that to me it was like you have all of this culture and knowledge and everything like right at your fingertips, and you don't have to pay a dime for it.
Yeah.
And that is it's a marvelous thing that when I first heard that, I was like, that can't possibly be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly it is this interesting, like, Air and Space obviously is the most, like, mass market of all museums, and it's the one that's just, for obvious reasons. I mean, there's some really cool shit there. But I feel like sometimes people have that kind of, like, ranking in their head. There's, like, the Air and Space is for the masses, and then there's, like, the real heads know about the other museums. And so, but yeah, I mean, it's endless, the number of kind of museums, not to mention research institutions and so forth.
And the zoo.
And the zoo, yeah. So, let's go into this history a little bit. I guess we do have to talk about James Smithson. What do we know about him?
James Smithson is kind of an interesting person. He's pretty wealthy. James Smithson is not American. He is British. He's a chemist. He's a mineralogist. He's living in 1829. He's, got this huge estate that he decides to will to his nephew. And if his nephew doesn't have any heirs, well, then he decides, you know what, I'm going to just make this a gift to the United States and to establish it for, a bunch of institutions that will increase knowledge among men. And it's wild that he does this because he's never been to the United States before.
He'd never been to the United States, which to my mind is so interesting, and it speaks to kind of this broader conversation that was being had about the United States, that it didn't have enough theoretical science. Yes, people were doing practical things with agriculture. Thomas Jefferson was there trying to figure out how to grow grapes, but there wasn't this kind of theoretical science. And so somebody needed to fund that so that the United States would have some sort of scientific basis upon which it could build. And he does this, I have to say. He not only wills an enormous sum of money, so $500,000 in like 19th century money, which is an obscene amount of money.
105 sacks of gold?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the thing. Like, it comes over in sacks of gold, like real Scrooge McDuck style.
Yes, Scrooge McDuck, that's what I was thinking.
Pour it all into the United States.
Yeah, and then what? They have to melt it down and then recoin it as U.S. currency. And to me, that's like the first in what seems like a sort of long period of people just being like, well, I guess that was nice of you, James Smithson, but what exactly do we do with this and this decree and this money? I mean, just kind of this like...
And what's your motivation?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Which, I don't think people really... I mean, it does seem like altruistic, but I mean... I don't think you can describe this as a burden, but it does feel like this thing just kind of gets plopped down out of nowhere. Like, here, now it's your problem. Figure this out. And my instructions are fairly open to interpretation. Established for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. All right, here you go. I'm dead. Do your thing.
Figure it out. Which is kind of how we read the Constitution today. Like, what did a bunch of dead guys mean? But yeah, like it's not like there was a process in place for what happens when somebody gives gobs of money to the federal government.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of figuring it out as they go along. And John Quincy Adams, in particular, is somebody who like he sees this money and he's like, it ain't going to the kids. Kids don't get this money. We're not educating children with this money. This money is going to astronomy. And he like spends years fighting to make sure, to be clear, no child will get their hands on this money.
He's really focused on that.
Really doesn't want that to happen. And let's get it to the stars. That's his big plan.
And he's trying to push it in that direction. But, he gets brought in. He was formerly a president, right, at this point, and he was, I think, an elected official at that point. I mean, one of the reasons he gets brought in to kind of be the head of this commission that's going to decide what's going to happen with this money is because President Jackson is like, I want no part of this. President Jackson kind of just sees nothing but like political potholes in front of him if he were to steer the process for dealing with this money. So he brings in Adams, and Adams does this quote where he says, this gift should, quote, not be filtered to nothing and wasted upon hungry and worthless political jackals. So even then we're going to do an episode actually about pork barrel politics, but you can see like a little bit of like, if people get their hands on this, they're going to just throw it at their pet issues. And we have to honor the spirit of what Smithson, as vague as he was, what Smithson was up to. And so that's where he starts to really kind of advocate and think about it. And yeah, his first thing is, there's a quote from John Quincy Adams in 1838. He says, I do not think the Smithsonian Institution should be a college or a university or a school of education for children, but altogether of a different character. Kellie, what do you make of that? That like...
I mean, to me, that sounds like a library.
Not explicitly not, but explicitly not an educational institution.
Yeah, higher education specifically, college or university. I mean, to me, I think that's key. I think of a library because I think of it as an institution that everyone has access to, regardless of age, income, your socioeconomic status, or your racial background. That colleges and universities were something that only really the elite could participate in. Not everybody's sending their kids off to Harvard or Yale. But to have something like this, a place where anyone can sort of walk off the street and get as much knowledge as they want, it's kind of revolutionary. And I would absolutely put it in the same sort of camp as libraries or things that the public can have access to gain knowledge.
Hey, this is David Rind. I'm an audio producer at CNN. And one of my favorite things about working at CNN is that I can call up our super smart correspondents and reporters whenever I want to pick their brains about the news and the stories they're covering. Well, I want to bring you in on those conversations with our podcast, CNN One Thing. Each week, I grab one of those said reporters and we break down one big story that's been making headlines. Again, the podcast is CNN One Thing. Listen on your favorite podcast app.
As summer winds down, I'm all about refreshing my wardrobe with staple pieces for the season ahead. And Quince nails it with luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished, perfect for layering and mixing. I recently went and picked out a couple pairs of slacks, a light jacket, because that crisp fall air will be here before we know it. And then I was looking around the Quince website and I noticed a section I hadn't seen before: kids. I'm not sure if this applies to you, but oh my gosh, my kid is going back to school soon. And not only that, they grew over the summer. That always kind of sneaks up on me. Well, luckily, Quince has stylish and affordable kids' clothes, so I quickly snagged a linen overshirt, a pair of kids' jeans, and even some new running pants. They also have kids' backpacks, by the way, just a tip. So, whether for you or whoever, Elevate your fall wardrobe essentials with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
There were these ideas that, oh yeah, we should make a library out of this. And there was real pushback. This was before the era of all of those big public libraries, before the robber barons in the late 19th and early 20th century are constructing them. And the argument hadn't yet been made that these are good things. And so you have some people who are like, what can you learn from a library, really? You have members of Congress who are saying that libraries are just clouds of windy verbiage, that there isn't actually a public service being done there because it is like a university, something only a few people will use, and there's no practical purpose for a library, so it should be something else.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a lot of sort of initial defining of what it shouldn't be, right? And it's like, well, we're not going to do it as university. Some people are saying, oh, we should endow some university chairs and so forth. Okay, that's off the table. And then, yes, like basically, if you were to collect the 10 things that Quincy Adams has said about this, 7 of them are like, definitely not for children. He's like, at one point, he's like, if we were to take this stranger's money and throw it at kids, it would be the same as dumping it into the Potomac. And it's like, all right.
Wow.
And I think,
Tell me how you feel about kids.
Yeah, and maybe it's because he does have fidelity to that phrase that Smithson issued, which was that it was supposed to increase knowledge, quote, among men. And so maybe he was like, well, I'm an originalist. I'm going to read the the actual language in this declaration. But nevertheless, not for kids. But there's still a wide spectrum of what it could be and what kind of field of scientific knowledge this could go towards. And I guess, NIki, you hinted at it, but this is a moment to talk about how Quincy Adams also seems very obsessed with the stars and astronomy. And that's basically what he wants to do. He's just like, let's just establish observatories.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that you have all of this money, so it should be plowed into something like an observatory, right? Some piece of scientific equipment that is very, very expensive and that can be the basis for a more theoretical science, because you do have a bunch of people coming forward and saying, actually, we should be using this for agriculture and to figure out how to breed horses and corn better. He's like, no, that's not the kind of science we're doing. We're doing the cool science with the stars and things, and figure out how all of this stuff works. And so that was just his obsession. But, Congress in some ways has control over all of this money, and so they have to figure out what it's going to be. And so all of these fights are being filtered through politics as well.
Well, I think the political aspect of it, too, becomes murky when you consider, who is giving the gift. The fact that the person is not American might make some people think, okay, are we being persuaded to go in one direction or another? Can anyone just come and give a gift to the country and then, make demands on what it should do or what it should be?
Right.
Which amazingly leads to this quote from a Whig representative from South Carolina who says, if we take this money and we use it and we make a Smithsonian institution, every whippersnapper vagabond would send a gift to the United States in order to immortalize his name. Those vagabonds.
Yeah, the slippery slope.
Sacks of gold.
The slippery slope argument. There's always one making that. But, it is interesting. I mean, as vague as Smithson's language is, because as we're seeing, you can really interpret that widely, just increased knowledge. Okay, that could be a bunch of different things. Often what happens with large gifts is they come with so many strings attached, especially now. It's I want to be used in this exact way and not in these, and then it's creates its own sort of cascading set of problems. So it's just kind of a big pile of money is going to cause a bunch of problems regardless. But, it is interesting in this scenario kind of how expansive the charge was. One other part of the conversation that really struck me was as the conversation was happening, I think largely it was do we do this to do scientific research or do we do this to do kind of educational advancement, right? So that's probably the divide. And the president of Brown University, interestingly, kind of made the case that societies often misuse science and technology for military and destructive purposes. And so this money should be used to, in his opinion, to teach the classics, which obviously is a vested interest. He's the head of Brown University. But gosh, this sounds like, 100 years early, Eisenhower calling out the military-industrial complex.
Yes.
And obviously we saw the way that universities and scientific research and military game, sort of melded together. But it was just really striking to hear someone this early on kind of point out how science and military efforts blend together. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were both right.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, listen, I just saw Oppenheimer not too long ago, and I was like, gosh, all of these guys needed a course in either the classics or ethics or some humanities.
Some liberal arts.
Some liberal arts. Yeah.
So how does a consensus start to emerge? I mean, I mentioned that it's 8 years of this kind of back and forth, in part because there's real disagreements and in part because it's a political process, right? And Congress is put in charge of it and Congress just moves slow on stuff. But what is the path towards this moment that we're marking today where they actually sign the bill and have a vision?
Well, it kind of is everybody gets a little something because they had so much money. It's like Oprah showed up and she was like, you get an institute and you get an institute
no
and
kids.
you get an institute. No children get an institute, to be clear. But so they create an institute that does have a library and it has a museum and it has a scientific research lab and it has a learning institute. There's an opportunity to sort of take all of the popular proposals and turn them into something because they have the money to do it. And then it is sort of consecrated in law. It exists outside of the federal government, but it's a federal institution. There's a congressional act that sets up the governing board, which involves basically all the people who run the country. And so you have the president and you have the secretary of state and you have the commissioner of patents and you have the chief justice. It has a lot of people, the mayor of Washington, D.C. And then they get to work on kind of building all of these different kinds of institutes of natural history and for scientific research. So everybody kind of gets what they want.
And art. We can't forget about art. A gallery for art. I love it.
And if you've been to D.C., the first building, right, is the so-called castle. And that's where originally everything started. And then they clearly built more buildings throughout D.C. And now, I mean, I was looking at the list. There's just, there's the obviously national history and the natural history and American history and the African American History Museum. But, there's Air and Space and the Hirshhorn, which is great, and the Freer and, all of the research capabilities and the zoo and so forth.
And the zoo.
Yeah.
And eventually Adams gets his observatory.
Yes, exactly.
Which is kind
and
of
the
cool.
National Observatory comes along. And poor Smithson, his documents and papers are stored in the castle in that first building, and a few years later it all burns down in a fire. And so if there was controversy or vagueness about what he wanted, there definitely is after the fire. But at that point I think the die had really been cast.
I bet John Quincy Adams came across a letter that said, actually, this should all go to the children,
kids.
and he just burned it all down. He was like, nope, this isn't getting out.
Yeah, for kids to not learn about astronomy. He's like, nope, no. But as we wrap up, I mean, I want to come back to this idea of it being free, especially in regards to kind of how we feel like it's fulfilling that original mission or not. I mean, I kind of will say that, generally speaking, I feel like, gosh, this feels like we're still living in the spirit of that original moment. And how many things can you say that about that haven't gotten sort of corrupted or co-opted over the decades, over the centuries?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you can get to Washington, D.C., I think it's a real privilege to be able to take part in these museums and find which one is your favorite, or to go to the space or to visit the institution that, you have the most passion for. It's a real treat. I love going to the art galleries. I love going to the museums. I love even going to the zoo, and taking my kids. There's so much to experience there. And I think the fact that it's free just makes it so accessible.
Yeah, I do agree that is a kind of spirit of publicness that you find less and less. But that idea that it's accessible to everyone it's such a gift, but it's also such a reflection of kind of the highest ideal of what a well-functioning small d democratic community should look like, that has education at its heart, but has education that's accessible to everyone. I think it's a really special thing in DC.
We will leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.